In 1991, Strategy and Tactics magazine featured a game called Trajan, the Roman Campaign in the East, designed by Joseph Miranda. Trajan covered the war between the Roman and Parthian empires in the 2nd century AD. By magazine wargame standards, at least, Trajan was well received, and it ultimately gave rise to three other games. This is the Board Game Geek page for Trajan. Four other games were published. There's the Trajan, Caesar and Gallia, Roman Civil War, and Germania. And these came to be known as the Ancient Wars series. In 2004, Decision Games republished or published a deluxe boxed edition called Trajan Advanced Trajan Ancient Wars series, which included all four of the magazine games plus some additional expansion content. There was also a separate expansion only kit that you could buy that just had the expansion materials. And part of the expansion materials were a consolidated rule set for all four of the games. In the original Trajan, this is the game map for Trajan. In the basic game, you had a combat system. When units of both sides were in the same hexagon, a battle would result, and the battle was resolved somewhat abstractly. There were basically 3 rounds of fire where units would fire at each other. But in the advanced rules, there was an optional battle board style resolution system where units that were engaged in a battle would be removed to a battle board, and this is the battle board. And you can see the battle board is a 9x9 grid. And the battle would be resolved in more granular fashion, sort of like battle board systems you might know from games like Columbia's Napoleon the Waterloo campaign, and a number of other games like the Clash of Arms, Civil War series. Many other games use a similar system where units are removed from the so-called strategic map, or what we can call a strategic map, and removed to a somewhat abstractly represented battlefield for more detailed battle resolution. I've never really been interested in ancient military history, although I do remember seeing Trajan on the shelves at the Complete Strategist in New York City, and I remember reading articles about it in some of the wargame related magazines, and it was somewhat intriguing to me, but I never did anything about it. But for some reason, a few months ago, I just got a hankering to take a look at Trajan and consider it for digital implementation. What I ended up implementing was only the battle board resolution system. Really, what was going on is I was supposed to be working on another project, and I was just looking for a way to procrastinate. So I figured I could knock out this battle board resolution implementation in a few weeks, and of course, it's now almost 3 months later that the project is mostly done. Although, in fairness, I've been putting off the project over the for to a large degree over the past month or so, because there was one particular feature that was just a pain in the ass to implement. So I was just avoiding working on the project. But in any event, it took me considerably longer than I had expected. Maybe at this point I should really stop overestimating my ability to knock these projects out. Anyway, today I'll walk you through the application, and there's one aspect of it in particular that I want to focus on, and I'll show you some code that I created for that. Because I didn't implement any of the, you might call, strategic game, there are really only stub implementations of like the strategic game turn, and there's no strategic map or anything like that, but there's just some of the stub architecture in case I ever wanted to go back and implement the full game. I'll just show you a quick class diagram of the simulation layer of the game. I think that this is pretty much final in terms of its overall structure, but the methods and attributes have changed quite a bit, or have been supplemented at the very least quite a bit from what you see on this diagram, because this is something I created fairly early on in the process. These are color coded because I'm not sold on whether or not they should be subclasses of the combat unit class as opposed to subclasses of the unit class. Anyway, you can feel free to pause the video and take a look at it. And by the way, this UML diagramming application is called Star UML, and the version I have is the free Nagware version, where it will just nag you forever, but it will basically allow you, full featured access to the application. I noticed that recently the new trial versions of the software will, there's an initial 2-week period or something like that in which you have free use of the application, but then after that it goes into read-only mode, which is a shame because it's a nice tool. But there are other UML diagramming tools out there. I think there's something called diagrams.io, which is pretty nice. And I think you can do UML diagrams in like OpenOffice or LibreOffice or things like that. And who knows, maybe even like Google's online suite of applications might have something like this. But it's a nice tool to have. The rules for the battle board system are about 5.5 pages, fairly dense type, not much in the way of diagrams or examples of play. And also they draw in a few rules from the main rules of the game. So altogether probably about six pages of rules. I'll summarize them now briefly. Basically, when both sides bring their units to the battle board, each side can secretly commit one or more stratagem markers. Those are markers that you gain through various game mechanisms, and one variant of the stratagem marker is called military stratagem. And so each side can secretly commit one or more military stratagem markers. And then you determine who has tactical superiority for the battle. And the tactical superiority player sets up second, meaning they get to see how the tactical inferiority player sets up first before they deploy. And also they get to move first as the attacker. So you determine tactical superiority by choosing one leader from each side. Each player chooses a leader to use his leadership rating. You add that leadership rating to the number of stratagems committed by that player, and then you roll a 6-sided die and added that to the total. And whichever player has the higher total has the tactical superiority. And so once that's determined, then the tactical inferiority player deploys his units on the battle board. The two main types of units that might appear on battle boards are the combat units themselves and leader units. There are also, you might say, supply train units called impedituses or impediti. I don't know how to pluralize that, but those are the 2 or maybe 3 main types of units on the battle board. I'll just give you a good view of the battle board right now, unadorned. This was actually a custom battle board made by a guy named Francois Vandermeulen, who has graciously allowed me to use it in my application. So this is the battle board itself. You can see it's 9x9. This is the Roman camp. This is the Parthian camp. In a typical battle, a set-piece battle, the camps will be in play, but there are two other ways that battles can occur, and this is all on the strategic map. You can have an ambush, and you can also have an attack from the march. And in either of those latter 2 circumstances, these camps don't exist. So you have leaders and combat units in play. Generally speaking, you can only stack 1 combat unit per square, along with an unlimited number of friendly leaders. In a camp square, which the designer's notes say basically abstractly represents a considerably larger area than one of these tactical squares. In a camp square, you can have an unlimited number of units, of friendly units. You cannot enter a square containing an enemy unit. Of course, you can destroy the enemy unit and then move in, but that's a different story. So the sequence of play is determine tactical superiority, then the inferiority player sets up first, then the superiority player sets up, and then you go into the turn sequence in earnest. There's an attacker battle turn followed by a defender battle turn. and the two battle turns are basically similar. There's a command segment in which you have to do a command check for all combat units. There are three possible outcomes of a command check. The unit is either in command, which means it moves and attacks normally, or it's out of command, in which case it can't move, but it can attack an adjacent enemy. And then there's Berserk, where the unit must move towards the closest enemy unit and attack it. You can use leaders to influence battles, and I'll just show you some of the sample units here in the game. So to take this unit, for example, that's the name of the unit. The symbol is auxiliary types, like light infantry and archers. This is the combat factor. This is the movement factor, and this is the movement factor on the strategic map. This is its battle movement factor, and this letter is very important. That's its discipline class. This is the discipline table from the game. So there are 5 levels. There's Barbarian, Mob, Recruit, Veteran, and Imperator. And so here are the 3 results, right? F means you fail the command check, G means you go berserk, and P means you pass the command check. So barbarians are very unlikely to act under your control. They're either going to be out of command or they're going to be berserk. In contrast, Imperator class units are most likely to pass the command check, and they're never going to fail it, but they might go berserk. There's a slight wrinkle in that each army has a panic level, and it's basically determined by the number of losses and disruptions that you take. And once you exceed your panic threshold, then that affects command checks. Then after the active player does his command segment, he then moves his units. Movement rates are fairly small in the game. There are 4 types of terrain, and the terrain is dictated by the terrain in the hexagon in which the battle occurs, the strategic map hexagon. So there's open terrain, there's swamp terrain, forest, and then there's mountain pass. Swamp and forest both restrict unit movements. The basic unit movement allowances are infantry types can move 1 square per movement segment, per friendly movement segment. Cavalry type units can move 2 squares, and leaders can move 3 squares. Light units have the additional capability of being able to move diagonally, whereas units that do not have the light trait can only move orthogonally, meaning north-south or east-west. If the terrain is swamp or forest, that reduces battle movements. I don't remember the details off the top of my head. If it's a mountain pass battle, then you use this special map, which is only three. I mean, this one's oriented 90 degrees counterclockwise, but if you imagine it rotated 90 degrees clockwise, you can see that it's three files wide. I call the rows the columns files and the rows ranks. So it's 3 files wide, but it's got the full 9 rank depth. So anyway, after the active player conducts his battle movement, then enemy missile-armed units get to do defensive fire. Basically, they can fire on 1 adjacent unit. Then after that, you do the friendly combat segment where the active player attacks the defender with his units, and it's a fire-based system. Here's the table. You can employ one of several tactics. Your unit type determines which of these tactics you can employ. And testudo is a special formation. That's the famous shield wall formation that the Romans used. So that's only certain, limited types of units can use that. And, it's your D6 and various results happen. I won't go through all the details here, but after the friendly combat segment, both sides can make rally attempts on their units. So various results on the battle board results table can result in a defender disruption or sometimes an attacker disruption. And during the rally segment, both sides get to attempt rallies of their combat units. And again, leaders can, I guess I didn't specify this, in the command segment, you can use a leader. Let's say you have a leader with an Imperator discipline rating. He can temporarily elevate the discipline rating of combat units in his square or in the 8 surrounding squares. So let's just say you have like a recruit discipline level unit. You probably want to elevate him to the Imperator level for the purposes of the command check. And the same thing happens in the rally segment, except leaders can only rally units in their own square. They don't have that one square radius. And then after both sides have finished doing their rally checks, then the defender does his battle turn, which is basically exactly the same. Battles last no more than 10 turns. In my experience with this application, they're probably going to be over before 10 turns elapse because one or both sides will have reached their panic thresholds and all sorts of bad things happen. One other thing bears mention, and that is that the camp squares, if a friendly combat unit enters an enemy camp square, the camp itself is destroyed, and the camps give certain defensive benefits to units, and Roman camps in particular give some additional defensive benefits. But once an enemy unit enters your friendly camp square, the camp itself is deemed to be destroyed, and the square loses all of its special defensive benefits. So I guess I'll start the application now, and we'll do some further explaining of the rules in that context. Just to preface launching the app, it's basically functionally feature complete. I say functionally, I mean aesthetically it is what it is, which is not great. These battle boards are fantastic. I love them, but the rest of the application is not so great. But it's mostly complete in terms of implementing the rules. The rules do have battle boards can have river terrain. Rivers can either appear in the middle or on the left or right side. That I have implemented. I'm pretty sure I've implemented the special terrain logic for rivers. But you can see this is a coastline terrain, which, you know, this graphic was produced for to print out, and so I guess you would print this out and just place it somewhere on there. But this is a coastline. There are actually fleet units in the game. I haven't implemented them, and I haven't implemented the amphibious assault style battles. So that's one thing that's lacking. I mean, it's fairly minor. Frankly, it wasn't all that interesting to me. So I'm pretty sure, like I said, that I've implemented the special terrain rules for like mountain pass terrain and forest swamp, that sort of thing. River, the river terrain and the way it inhibits movement. But it seems like 2 months ago, so I'm not even 100% sure. The undo redo capability in the game is shaky. It really only is implemented for movement and your initial deployment. But I'm not 100% confident in that code. And also, I guess one thing I should have mentioned in the rule summary: if certain missile type units, like horse archers and light cavalry, if they conduct a missile attack in their battle phase, then they can do something called a skirmish move. They can move once again. So it's kind of like those situations where you have horse archers, swooping in, firing missiles, and then scooting away before the less mobile defenders can get their pound of flesh. But in the rules, leaders can, if a leader is in a square that the missile unit conducted its attack from, then when the skirmishing unit or the light unit moves away, the missile unit moves away, the leaders can accompany the missile unit, so they can kind of swoop in and swoop out along with the light units. That post-attack movement is called skirmish movement in the game. But in any event, I don't think I've implemented the ability to have leaders join the skirmish units as they're retreating. But just about everything else I think I've implemented. So with all that said, let's launch the application. As with my other wargaming projects, I've used the Qt application framework and Qt Creator, which is the IDE that comes with Qt. One other thing before starting, in the original version of the battle board rules, there wasn't any hidden information. All counters were placed face up on the battle board. So I was able to implement the application as a very straightforward, you might say crude, hot seat style game. So I don't have to, you don't really have to switch back and forth between player views and things like that. In a subsequent article in Moves magazine, there were some further optional rules to have units like played face down on the battle board until spotted and revealed. I chose not to implement that. I just, even though I'm usually all about the limited intelligence type of stuff, for this project I just stuck with the battle board rules as they were originally implemented, as they were originally articulated. So let's start. I did add a few optional rules of my own device. Rather than explain them to you, I'll just show you the tooltips, and if you want to read them, you can just pause the video. So the only one we'll use is this auto continue testudo formation. And now we'll go into the main interface. So I did try and include some explanatory material of a quasi tutorial nature, throughout the application. Again, you can read this if you want, and just pause the video if you want to read through it. So you'll notice that just to start out, all of each player's forces are stuck on are placed on their camp square, and then you can deploy them from there. This is the this is a modal dialog box, so it won't let me move this. But so it's in this battle, you can see the Romans. The Romans have tactical superiority. Romans are these salmon pink ones. The Parthians are these blue and green counters. So because Romans won tactical superiority, the Parthians have to deploy their forces first. So what I did in order to speed up development, I didn't want to have to constantly deploy units manually. So you'll see that they're just going to start deploying themselves. That's because, let's move this off. Oh, we can't move that off screen yet. All right, we're going to have to just go through this, blah, blah, blah. So just to show you one thing before I forget, there's usually not much in the way of stacking except in the very beginning, but you can cycle through stacks using the mouse wheel. You can go in both directions if you want. These counters here with these, I think these are snake symbols of some kind. These are leaders. The rest are all combat forces of various kinds. This is a Roman leader. The rest, this is a supply train, and these are various combat units. Just to show you quickly, I tried to implement a very streamlined user interface that's mostly just clicking and dragging units. We'll go into that in a little more depth later in the video, but just to show you, I mean, to move a unit, you just click on it, and if it's a valid move, right? You can only stack one combat unit per square, so obviously you can't deploy this unit here, here, or here. You can put it here because there's only a leader in this square. You can put it here, but in any event, it's a very simple interface. And what I was just going to show you before, and I was thwarted by that modal dialog box, is that this event log, you can move it off to a different monitor if you want. Also, if you double click anywhere, it opens up this this filtering option. So, if you don't want to see unit status changes, you can click that box and it'll hide those, or you can show it again. Phase begin end messages, right? But we'll leave that there for now. This is the phase done button. So when a player is done with their phase, you click this button and it moves to the next phase. So currently we're in the Parthian deployment phase. And actually, a word about this. This is a font called, I think it's called Bloody Scary Regular. I don't know if anyone thinks it fits, but I've used that in a variety. You'll see this font is going to crop up in symbols that are on the images. So in any event, it's a Parthian deployment phase. Once I click this button, that'll signify that the Parthian player is done deploying his units, and it'll transition to the Roman deployment phase. And we just get this message again because it's just a deployment message. And again, I just kind of scripted the opening deployments because it gets extremely tedious to do this manually when you've launched the application for the 5,000th time to try and track down a bug. Okay, so the Romans are done. Now we'll go to the Roman command segment. You get this little tutorial-esque pop-up. You can pause the video and read that if you want. Now there's something to bear in mind here. Obviously, these images just appeared. I want to bring up the let's look at the discipline table again for a minute. I tried to remove basically things that are non-choices from the player. Things that there's really only one decision you could make in a given situation. There's no need to force the player to go through and do things that there's no rational reason to not do. So in the command check phase, anytime a unit is within command influence range of a veteran or imperator leader, remember, as I explained earlier, imperator and veteran, leaders of any kind can lend their discipline class to units in their square or in adjacent squares for purposes of a command check. So if you are, for example, a recruit mob or barbarian discipline level, there is no conceivable reason, as far as I can tell, that you would not want to take advantage of the benefit of a veteran or imperator leader. That's not necessarily true if it's a recruit leader and a barbarian unit, or a mob leader and a recruit unit. There's a little more tactical nuance, but I can't see any reason why a veteran would not want to take advantage of an imperator leader, or why any of the other three discipline level class units would not want to take advantage of a veteran or imperator leader. So for that reason, the system checks, and for any unit that can benefit from an adjacent leader. So if you see this 2 cap unit, its intrinsic discipline level is V for veteran, but it's within command range of Trajan, who is an imperator level leader. So all of these units are automatically taking advantage of Trajan's benefit. And likewise, this Syrian horse archer unit, which is a recruit level unit, is next to Severus, who's a veteran leader. So his rating is automatically applied to the Syrian unit. So now you can also manually make changes in just because of this setup. There's no there's no unit that's going to there's no recruit or there's no other recruit or barbarian or mob units who could be influenced by another leader in a more discretionary fashion. So when I click this button, so normally if there were, then you could just click this command button and then drag, you could click on a leader and drag it over to the unit you want to influence. But in this case, there's just no opportunity to do that because everyone is either a veteran or taking advantage of an imperator, or in this case, taking advantage of the veteran. So I'll click the phase done button and the system will automatically do command checks for all of these units. Okay, so just want to show what happened here. B means that the unit got a berserk result on the command table, meaning that in the forthcoming Roman movement phase, these units they must move towards the nearest Parthian unit and must attack if they get adjacent to a Parthian unit. In the game, the player controls the movement of berserk units. To me, that doesn't seem very realistic. They're berserk. They're not under your command. So there is, you might say, artificial intelligence that controls the movement of berserk units. So it's not under the player's control. If any of these units had just failed the command check, instead of getting a berserk result, a question mark would appear here. And if they pass the command check, then there would be no marker on the unit. And just, I guess, to state the obvious, one of the nice things about digital applications, digital implementations of board games, is you can do away with all of the clutter occasioned by information markers by just incorporating the information right onto the unit counter itself. I mean, you have to be somewhat judicious about it. I mean, you can't like super clutter up the counter, but those are implementation issues. In any event, so the Roman command phase is done. It's now what I call the testudo segment. In the game, when a testudo capable unit wants to go into testudo formation, I think the rules say you have to do so at the beginning of your movement phase, and that testudo formation lasts all the way through your turn and all the way through the enemy player's turn, and then at the beginning of your next movement phase you get to decide whether to continue in testudo formation or not. So I created an additional phase that happens after the command segment, and well, I should say an additional segment that happens after the command segment and before the movement segment, and during that time you have to decide whether or not to use testudo formation or not. You'll see that I think I have the system auto apply testudo to this one, again just for testing purposes. So we'll click this. Right, so this unit has had testudo, is now in testudo formation. If I want to take him out, I can just click on it, just a left click, put it back on. You can see the little event appears here. By the way, we can hide that filter display. If I wanted to put this one in testudo, not all units can be in testudo, only Roman legions and Roman auxiliary type units after starting with 27 BC and thereafter. But before then, even auxiliary units can't use testudo formation, and Parthian units can't use testudo at all. So we'll now finish, we're now done with the Roman testudo segment. It's now the Roman movement segment. So the berserk units are all moving under system control. And one of the interesting things about writing this application and seeing the game in progress is that many times a significant fraction of your force is not under your effective command because they're either out of command or berserk, and battles kind of take on a shape of their own, a course of their own over which you have relatively little influence. And one of the objectives of the game, as you see from the designer notes, is to show the superiority of smaller but well-disciplined forces over larger but less well-disciplined forces. So the system moves berserk units first. Then the player can move any units that are in command. And again, when I wrote this application, I tried for a very streamlined interface. So again, it's just click and drag, right? Move him here. If I try and move, like again, there's no stacking for combat units, so these are not valid moves, but that's a leader only square. He could move there. This unit is not capable of moving diagonally, so he can't move there. So we'll move him up here, move up Trajan. Auxiliary units can move diagonally, though you can't move diagonally if there are combat units on both of the squares adjacent to the diagonal move. So he couldn't move there, even though he's not prohibited by stacking reasons, but he's blocked because there are 2 units that would block that movement. But since there is not a friendly unit there, this diagonal move is possible, but we'll just put him there. And again, this number here is the unit's battle movement rating. So most, like, infantry units generally only have a movement of 1. Cavalry type units have a movement of 2. Leaders have a movement of 3. So since you can see from the tooltip, he has 0 movement points remaining. So even if we try to move him, we won't even get the arrow. And I'll explain the validation procedure a little later. But we'll just finish up here, move him there. Okay, so the Roman movement segment is done. The next segment is the opposing player's defensive fire segment, but defensive fire is only possible into adjacent squares, so there's no defensive fire possible. So it's a moot point right now. So it's the same thing with the combat segment. Combat is only possible against units in adjacent squares, so it's also just a moot point. So there's nothing to do there. Now we're in the rally segment. Obviously, I've got some more explaining to do there. So no units are disrupted yet. Rally is for units that are in disrupted state. So since neither side has had any disrupted units yet, there's really no rallying possible, but we'll get to that in a moment. Also, I just want to call attention to the tooltip again to give a shout out to Francois for allowing me to use his nice battle board image. One thing I didn't point out, these green bars here, these are the panic meters for the Romans and the Parthians. So these show how close you are towards reaching your panic level. And there's 2 formulas for determining whether or not an army has reached its panic threshold, but they're either based on unit losses or a combination of unit losses and current unit disruptions. Since neither side has had any disrupted units or any destroyed units, they're both at 0% progress towards either of those 2 panic threshold formulas. So there's nothing for the Romans to rally, nothing for the Parthians to rally, so this will put us into the next turn, which will be or I should say, it will now be the Parthian player turn. So it's the Parthian player's command segment. We don't really need to see these anymore. So just as with the Roman units and their imperator leaders, these 2 units can benefit from this veteran leader here. I should add this unit here also can benefit from Sanitruses. Who's a veteran, but this is a good example of discretionary discretionary leadership, because there are certain circumstances whereas veterans and imperator leaders would always be applied to a mob discipline level unit, it's not clear cut as to whether or not you would want a recruit leader to modify a mob unit or a mob leader, no pun intended, to modify like a recruit level unit. So here it is discretionary, and the way you would do that is by, again, dragging and clicking. And now this unit is temporarily changed to recruit discipline from its innate mob level. Now I think to get rid of that, we just click on it, or I forget how we get rid of that. I think we got to click that. Yeah, okay. So with this button activated, yeah, so you drag to apply it, and you just left click to remove it. So once we click this button, the system will calculate do all the command checks for all of the Parthian units. Don't need to see that anymore. Oh boy. So a lot of the Parthians also failed their command checks and are now moving under system control. So as I mentioned earlier, the question mark indicates a unit that's out of command. So those units are not eligible to move. I'm clicking and dragging and nothing happens. Likewise, you can click and drag on a berserk unit and it's not eligible to move. But let's see, we can move some of these leaders up. So that was the Parthian movement segment. Okay, the next phase will be the Roman defensive fire segment. Most units are not capable of missile fire, but auxiliary units are. So this button here indicates the use of a fire tactic like defensive fire or offensive fire, but it's the defensive fire phase. So hey, why not? Again, I tried to streamline the interface, so to employ defensive fire, you just click on the unit, right? So it can't fire on a friendly, can't fire on an empty square, but it's eligible to fire on this unit. And as you can see, here's the combat adjudication. It achieved a disruption result. So this unit would be eligible to attempt rally next turn, since its morale state is now affected. So that is it for none of these other units are eligible for defensive fire. Berserk units, incidentally, the system will determine whether or not Berserk units will employ defensive fire. And there's a random number generation involved there. But okay, so the Roman defensive fire segment is done. Now, once I click this, we're going to go to the Parthian combat segment. And all of these Berserk units, or at least this disrupted units, can't attack. But these two units are Berserk, and since they already start, they were already adjacent to a Roman unit, and they're going to attack this unit automatically, regardless of, there's nothing you can do as the player to stop it because they've gone Berserk. And likewise, this unit will also attack. It will probably attack this one. The pathfinding algorithm. One of the issues in the game, I'll maybe talk about this a little later. It uses the A-star pathfinding algorithm. In the game, there's no additional cost for the units that can move diagonally. It still only costs 1 movement point. So that kind of skews the A-star algorithm to an extent, because moving orthogonally doesn't cost any less than moving diagonally. And so in calculating the closest unit for purposes of attack, it's possible that the A-star, I don't even remember now because it was a couple of months ago that I implemented it, the A-star may treat either of these units, either this FSA unit or this IT unit, as just as close as the 12th Legion, even though from a strictly Euclidean standpoint, they're further away, but we'll see. I think this unit's going to attack that one. But anyway, here we go. Okay. So let's see what we got here. Right. Okay. So the Parthian Guard heavy cavalry unit, which is this one, attacks 12th Legion. Light result eliminated. That's since this is not a light unit, it's a no effect. The way the combat system works is you roll one die for each strength point that you have. So this unit got to roll 2 dice. So the first attack was a light unit eliminated, result no effect. The second unit was a cavalry disordered. That only applies for elephant units attacking cavalry. So basically no effect. Over here, the Persis horse archers employed offensive missile fire combat against 3rd Syrian. And it rolled a 6, which that's a missile depletion result. This little X over the arrow indicates missile depletion. And there's an optional rule that you can use to affect missile depletion. But essentially what missile depletion does under the game rules as written is that, let's say you have a 3 strength unit. So you roll the first die, and let's say it's no effect. You roll the second die, it's a missile depleted result. That precludes you from rolling any more dice in that combat. Right? Now this unit only has a strength of 1, so the missile depleted result really is of no effect. And it's really of no effect because the missile depletion status is removed at the end of the combat round, right? So next turn, this unit will be capable of defensive fire. It will be capable of attacking with missiles again. That optional rule in that very first pop-up dialogue, you can actually select the optional rule to make a missile depletion result permanent for the rest of the battle. And you can also specify a number of times that you can get a missile depletion result before it turns permanent. So that's up to the user. But here we're just using the rules as written. So that attack, missile depleted, no effect. Then the 4th horse archers unit attacks, roll is a 2. Defender breaks, attacker disrupted result. So a defender breaks result against an undisrupted unit just results in a disruption, but that result also causes a disruption to the attacker. So that was the Parthian combat segment. We'll now go to the rally segment. So to rally a unit, you just click the rally button, and before your army reaches a panic threshold, rally attempts there's no reason not to try them because the worst thing that happens is you fail. Once your army panics, if you try and rally a unit and the result is you use the discipline table. Let's find that. Right, so you use the discipline table for rally attempts. So if your army has panicked and you roll, let's say it's a recruit unit that you're attempting to rally, if you get a going berserk, a G result, instead of it being no effect, the unit is eliminated. But prior to panic, the worst thing that happens is, either you pass, in which case the disruption is removed, or you either fail or get a going berserk result and it's no effect. The unit just remains disrupted. So there's no reason not to make a rally attempt prior to panic, but after your army hits panic level, then you need to consider whether you want to risk unit elimination. So it's the Roman rally segment. Might as well. So you just left click a unit to attempt a rally. Voila, it's rallied. Now the rules don't specify what happens when a unit that is disrupted, what command status it has. It really is a moot point because the command status will be redetermined before anything else happens anyway. But I chose to, when a disrupted unit rallies, it's just temporarily in out of command state. So let's see, those are the only disrupted Roman units, so we're done there. Parthian rally will... Okay, that was a successful rally. That's it. So that should conclude the first game turn. Incidentally, the turn is recorded here, and the year of the battle is also set forth there. Okay, so it's now turn 2. We're back to the Roman command segment. We don't need to see this anymore. Again, leader influence has been auto-applied. There's really, for the Romans, there's really no opportunity to apply leader influence anyway. So we'll do so we'll now have the system do all of the command checks. Let's just see. Okay, good. So for the Romans, all of their units passed their command checks. You can just see all that here. Roman testudo segment. We won't change the status of any unit. Roman movement segment. Okay. Now, this unit cannot move diagonally because there are combat units adjacent to the vertex through which it's moving. So FSA will move there. See, this unit can't move diagonally. It's not a light unit, so we can only move it there. But we'll move this unit up, this one. We can put this auxiliary unit there. We'll move Trajan up there. And these little tool tips will tell you how many movement points you have remaining. Okay, so we're done with the Roman movement segment. So it's the Parthian defensive fire segment. Berserk units may or may not employ defensive fire. Oh, okay, so yeah. The fourth horse archers did employ defensive fire against the 3rd Syrians, no effect. The Persis unit did not. The system determined that it was not going to employ defensive fire. So that's that. Okay, now it's the Roman combat segment. Now, there's something in the game called flanking attacks. If a unit is attacked from 2 different directions by anything other than missile fire, it is flanked, let's put it that way, and all units that are attacking after the first unit have their combat strength doubled. And I should also add, units can attack diagonally, but only with missile fire. So here's we'll try this flank attack here. We'll have the Syrians. These buttons here are the different tactics available in the game. Not all units can use tactics. So light cavalry type units, including horse archers, this is the charge tactic. Light cavalry cannot employ charge. So you see, it's eligible to attack, but it's not, since the arrow is not turning mostly solid, it means it's not a valid choice. And in this case, it's not a valid choice of tactic. So we'll just use the old phalanx tactic. That's kind of a general term for your basic combat formation. It isn't necessarily a phalanx in the true sense. Well, let's see if I don't remember. Are these capable of wedge? Yeah, they are. Okay, so we'll do a wedge attack against this Parthian's horse archer. The game gives you the option of rolling less than the total number of dice you're entitled to. I don't really see the reason for doing that. They do give a rationale for it, in that there are missile depletion, there are potential attacker disruption results. And so if you roll less than all of the dice you're entitled to roll, there's a less of a chance of being disrupted in the attack, of having the attack disrupted. To me, that doesn't make any sense, because the risk reward just scales, right? I mean, if you only roll 1 die, yeah, you have a smaller chance of being disrupted, but you also have a smaller, commensurately smaller chance of inflicting damage on the enemy. So it doesn't make any sense, but I left this in anyway to give the players the option. Maybe I'm missing something. So we're gonna roll with all 3 dice, because he's got an attack strength of 3. Oh, okay, so we achieved an elimination of that unit. The big old bloody X is an elimination. We're not going to advance, because that could potentially lead to a flanking attack by this unit. So we'll hold position. This is a light cavalry unit, but it's not missile capable, so it can't attack. It can move diagonally, but it can't attack diagonally with missile fire. So we'll also use a charge tactic. Okay, so the attacker was disrupted in that attack, but this unit is currently flanked. So if we now attack with the 2 cap, this is the, I don't know how to pronounce it, quincunx? Quinsunx? I should have looked that up before making this video, but we'll use the Quinsunx tactic against the companion cavalry unit. And because it's a flank attack now, it gets to use 8 dice, so we'll see. So what happened is the first die that was rolled was a no effect. The second die roll was a no effect. The third die roll was an attacker disrupted, which means that the remaining 5 dice that it could have rolled are basically not used. It can't be used. So what do we got here? This is a missile capable unit, so we'll use offensive fire against the companion. If offensive fire can only, missile fire can only inflict disruption. So we got everything that we could get. This SK marker means that if you recall, I mentioned that certain types of light units, missile capable light units, if they employ missile fire, can then employ skirmish moves right after. It has to be done right after the attack. So we could now move this unit. We're not going to, but we could have moved that unit if we wanted to scurry away from the defending unit that we just disrupted. Let's see, what else do we got here? I really need to put some kind of symbol on the units indicating that they've already attacked, but that goes on the to-do list. Let's try another flanking attack here. We'll just do a wedge attack by the Legion. 5 dice. Oh, it eliminated. Okay. So we will advance after combat. By the way, notice that because the Parthians have now taken losses, they're now 34% of the way towards one of their 2 panic thresholds. Namely, this is the panic threshold based on losses. At the end of the combat segment, by the way, these semi-translucent destroyed units will be removed to a holding area over here, right? Because obviously this is not ideal to have them there. So that kind of thwarted our combat attempt, didn't it? All right, well, let's just roll. Let's just keep rolling here. Let's do a quincunx attack. Boy, that's a dangerous word. Wow. Oh dear. Okay. Do we want to advance? Yeah, let's advance. Okay, because if you have an unprotected leader, meaning a leader in a hex by himself without a friendly combat unit, then he would be automatically eliminated if an enemy unit moved in. So it's a good thing that this Aegean unit is there to protect Trajan. But this is going to be over quickly. Did he attack already? I can't even remember. Let's try another wedge attack here. No, he's already attacked, right? Okay. Oh, that's right. He's the one who just advanced. Okay. So let's try quincunx. Oh, I'm sorry. Since he's in testudo formation, he can only use testudo, a testudo attack tactic. So we might as well. Yes. Okay, 2 no effect results with those dice. So did this unit attack? This is heavy cavalry, so he could use a charge. So let's charge this defender. Oh. Okay, well, you can see the Parthians have just panicked. So this fight was over fast. Future me chiming in here just to highlight a few things that I overlooked. First of all, I want to show you the about dialogue. contains a few credits to the people who created the fonts that I use, the battle board creators, the counter sheet image uploaders. Also, this font, when I was creating the application, I wanted to use a period appropriate font, and so I went online and searched for ancient Roman fonts or something like that. And one of the very first results was a font called Trajanus Roman. So needless to say, I raced to install that and use that throughout the application. Unfortunately, it doesn't render all that great, and the problem is like ends. The end, I don't know how this is going to show up on video capture, but the diagonal line on the ends is very faint, and it sort of breaks up the text, and it makes it a little bit difficult to read. So in certain places in the application, I use a font called Romanus, but which I don't. It doesn't look to me as good as Trajanus Roman, but it. And one of the problems is it's one of those fonts that uses like small caps, like it's all cap letters, but true capitalized letters are just a little bit taller than the other ones, so it's a little bit harder to read. And in fact, it's the Romanus font that I use here in the message log, the event log. It's a nice font. It's just the Trajanus Roman it's a very nice looking font, but it just unfortunately has these rendering issues. You'll also notice some of the explanatory pop-ups. I'm just using good old Times Roman because for maximum clarity, but I'm going to have to rationalize the use of font in this application. Also, another thing that occurred to me when I rewatched the video, the first part of the video. Let's just get through all this. Incidentally, all of those pop-ups, those explanatory pop-ups, those are conditionally compiled, so I've just suppressed those that code for purposes of the last part of this video, just because we don't want to see those dialogues popping up again and again. Let's just go to why don't we say the Roman combat segment, and I'm going to use a debug feature that allows me to it gives me the god-like ability to delete units just for testing purposes. So, okay, so you see the panic meter. Okay, I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the video, but you'll see there's text here now that says panic once you reach the panic level. I changed the font to the Romanus font. The Trajanus Roman just wasn't showing well when I was editing the video yesterday, so hopefully this will show up a little bit better in the video capture. Also, one thing I don't think I explained in the video is that this array of forces, this is just totally contrived by me for testing purposes, because again, there's no strategic game to generate the battles, so these are just a subset of the total forces involved in the overall game, and I just picked a selection of forces to use for testing purposes. That is all. Future me, over and out. All right, let's just conclude the Roman combat segment. Okay, so you can see that all of these destroyed units have just been removed to this penalty box over here on the side. The main effect that panic has is that units that are disrupted are deemed to be routed in a routed state, and routed units must in the friendly movement phase, they must move towards the friendly battle board edge. So in the case of Parthians, any disrupted unit, whereas pre-panic a disrupted unit can't move, post-panic a disrupted unit is deemed routed and must move towards the friendly map edge, and if it reaches the friendly map edge, it must try and move off the friendly map edge. And in addition, units that are under normal morale and in command, they normally cannot move off a map edge, but if their army is routed, then if their army is panicked, then even if they are in command and not disrupted, they can move off the map edge. So you can try and, if half of your army is fleeing and you want to try and save the rest, you can, all of your undisrupted units you can attempt to have them flee also. I believe that at the conclusion of a battle, all units that fled off the battle board, there's a 50% chance for each unit that it's eliminated. So it's not great to flee, but sometimes you just don't have a chance. Rather, sometimes you just don't have a choice. Oh, also, I was just reminded by the game this information. I believe the rule is as soon as your army panics, all units of yours that all units of the panicked army that are currently disrupted become routed. So the R is for rout. D is disrupt, R is rout. So it's the Roman rally segment. He's a veteran. There's really no one in range that can help him. So failed to rally. Okay, let's see if we can. Who else is this guy's disrupted? Oh, okay. He's not. I'm trying to drag Trajan over to him to influence him, but remember, you can only influence units in your square for rally purposes. So we'll attempt to rally him. He also failed to rally. And one more time with him. Okay, he succeeded in rallying. So let's now go to the Parthian rally segment. Now, again, this unit is routed. We can make a panic, we can make a rally attempt for him, but if he gets a berserk result, he's eliminated. So let's just give it a shot. Okay, he succeeded. They don't have any other disrupted units. Okay, so we're done there. Now it's going to go to turn 3 and the Roman command. Interesting. Why is that happening? Oh, I'm sorry. It's the Parthian segment, not Roman. So what kind of shambles do we have here? Okay, so he's being influenced. All right, well, let's see how it goes. Okay, so these guys failed their command attempt. I guess that's another effect of panic. When you fail a command attempt, you become disrupted, which means they're going to do a panic move. They're going to try and flee off map. So it's a Parthian movement segment. That's interesting. They should have moved. Well, we'll have to track that bug down. Roman defensive fire segment. You can't actually fire at leaders, but you could occupy their hex, their square in the movement phase. But let's see. He can't fire. He can't fire. All right, no defensive fire opportunities. Well, maybe we should restart this battle. Let's just exit. Okay, so I went back and I checked the rules, and actually it appears that the game is implemented correctly in the respect of these two units. I was wondering why, since the Parthians have panicked, why they didn't automatically become routed instead of just disrupted, and being routed, why they didn't, start fleeing towards the map edge. And I had misremembered the rules. They simply failed their command check with just a fail result and not a berserk result. Normally when you fail a command check, nothing happens, but post panic, a failed command check just results in a disruption and not being routed unless you were already disrupted. For that reason, it appears that the game is working correctly. So now let's go on to the second part, or the last part, I should say, of the video, where I wanted to show you some of the validation code and just talk through some of the issues involved there. Let's talk about high-level UI issues for a moment. I had two main goals for the UI in the program. First, I wanted to keep it as streamlined as possible. That means keeping pop-up dialog boxes, menus, etc. to a minimum and allowing the player to get by with just mouse clicks and drags. Second, I wanted to minimize coupling between the UI and rules engines modules. So to that end, I'll just give you a brief overview of the interaction between the UI and the rules engine. The rules engine is responsible for maintaining game state. So for example, unit locations, the status of a current unit, like its remaining movement points, whether it's done moving, its command status, its morale, etc. And the rules engine also maintains other game parameters like army panic levels and so on. Equally importantly, the rules engine is responsible for enforcing the rules of the particular game. The UI is responsible for displaying game state to the user and allowing the user to effectuate various changes to the game state. So the user will effectively propose some action, such as by clicking on a unit with the mouse and dragging the unit to a new square. This is merely a requested action. The UI passes this request on to the rules engine for validation. The rules engine responds either that the proposed action is invalid or that it's valid. If it's valid, then the UI instantiates a command object, such as move unit here. I'll show you, these are the command classes in the game. You can hopefully get an idea from the names, the kinds of things they do. But the command object is posted to the so-called command history object, which calls the execute method on the command object, which in turn calls one or more methods in the rules engine. That sets into motion various effects in the rules engine. And to the extent that those effects should be visible to the player, they are then reported back to the UI layer in the form of events. The UI displays those events to the user, such as by moving the unit image to its new square, or putting information on the unit counter like disruption or failed command check or command influence, and so on. But in the spirit of minimizing coupling between the UI and rules engine, I tried to keep the UI code as ignorant as possible of the rules of the game. Unfortunately, as you'll see, that's not always easy when you're also trying to keep the interface simple. But with that said, let's take a closer look at the code. First, we need to take a quick look again at the class structure from the simulation layer. Just a reminder that entity is the parent class of unit, which is the parent class of both leader and combat unit. Paralleling this in the UI layer, you have the entity item class, which is the parent of the unit item class, which is the parent of the combat unit item and leader item classes. So this is the entity item class. I want to focus on what happens when you click on a unit and drag it. That happens when you want to move a unit, when you want to cause a unit to attack another unit. For that matter, when you're clicking on a leader during the command check phase and you're dragging from the leader onto a unit to whom you want to apply the leader's discipline rating for command check purposes. So let's follow the program execution flow when the user clicks and drags a combat unit. When the user clicks within the bounding rect of a graphics item, the entity item gets a mouse press event. You can ignore most of this for now, but just note that the entity item reflects the fact that the mouse left button has been pressed and just records the position of the mouse in local coordinates in the entity item's local coordinate system. If the user just releases the mouse without really doing anything else, the entity item gets a mouse release event. Again, you can ignore all this stuff, but the entity item just sets the mouse left button pressed to false and sets the mouse current position to some clearly invalid value. We'll deal with these handle functions a little later. So if the entity item gets a mouse move event, it checks to see whether the mouse left button is pressed and also whether the mouse has moved a combined 6 pixels of vertical and or horizontal distance from the position in which the mouse was first pressed down, the left button was first pressed. If not, then we assume the user just intended a mouse click and maybe inadvertently dragged the mouse slightly. Otherwise, we treat it as a deliberate click and drag on the unit. So we set M mouse drag in progress to true. We check to see whether or not the unit is currently in a grid square. Grid square item is the UI counterpart class to the grid square in the simulation module. Also, note that in the code and in this video, I call the rules engine code the simulation module, or sometimes I just call it the rules engine module or rules engine layer. That's all just synonymous. You can treat, for present purposes, you can treat simulation and rules engine, those terms, interchangeably. So anyway, the entity item's grid square function will return a null pointer if the unit has been eliminated and is off on the right side, as you saw in the gameplay part of this video. If the unit is currently in a grid square, meaning it hasn't been eliminated, then we get the grid square over which the mouse is currently positioned, and we pass that grid square to the handle drag validation function. And note that the mouse may be outside the battleboard grid at the time of this mouse movement event, in which case battle scene grid square at position will just return null pointer. But either way, we pass that pointer to the mouse's current grid square, or null pointer, to this handle drag validation function. And actually, having not looked at this code closely in a while, I'm immediately seeing a refactoring opportunity because there's no valid user action if the mouse is dragged outside of the battleboard grid. So if battle scene grid square at position returns null pointer, we could just exit this code block and do nothing else. But I'm not going to refactor now because there's always unintended consequences. I don't want to break anything right now. So we'll just take a look at this. Handle drag validation is a pure virtual function. All right, pure virtual function. For this example, we'll assume that the user has clicked and dragged a combat unit item, and remember that entity item is the indirect parent class of the combat unit item class. So we'll look at combat unit items override of the handle drag validation function. So the function first checks to make sure that the unit hasn't been eliminated. And frankly, this check is probably redundant of the call in the previous function to the grid square function, because if grid square returns a null pointer, that, as far as I can recall, means that the unit has been eliminated. So we don't really need to check this again, but might as well be belt and suspenders. And it also checks to make sure that there are no animations in progress. You might recall the blue arrows that appear and then fade out when a unit moves, and you'll probably also recall the succession of berserk units moving autonomously, and those arrows appearing. The rules engine sends a flurry of unit moved events for the berserk units, and if all of those animations occurred at once, it would be just more difficult for the user to see what's going on, because all of a sudden units would just kind of warp into their new positions, and all of these arrows would appear at the same time, and it's kind of hard to see who's moving. So most animations are queued by battle scene and shown sequentially, and we don't want the user to undertake any actions while the animations are occurring. So if there are animations in progress, we'll just skip any validation process for this mouse move event. But assuming the unit hasn't been eliminated and there aren't any animations in progress, then we enter this code block, and we can ignore this for now. That has to do with a special tactic called relief of line, but we're just going to overlook that for right now. You can see that the entity item class, and this is a member of the entity item grandparent class of combat unit item, but the entity class has a pointer back to the corresponding entity class object in the simulation module. I'm not entirely happy with this. It's more highly coupled than I'd like. Each entity object in the rules layer, in the simulation layer, has a unique ID number. So we could just give that ID number to the corresponding entity item, and then it could pass that ID number together with all of the validation data to some intermediate object or intermediary object that sits between the UI and the rules engine, maybe the facade pattern, and that way we could avoid, having this kind of direct access into the simulation. But that's for another day. In any event, you can see that there's this call to the validate battle action method in the entity class in the rules engine. This is a good example of the way in which I attempted to minimize the UI's knowledge of the game rules. I was hoping I could just use this generic validate battle action method to validate all types of user actions. But you've already seen in the code above and below a couple of the more specific, validate blank function calls. And, as I'll show you a little bit later, my attempt to just, confine everything to this very generic multi-purpose function, it was problematic because the logic in the rules engine layer was starting to get, in the UI layer was starting to get really tangled. In fact, it was also getting tangled in the rules engine. So, I may have just been better off using very specific validation methods all along. I guess I'll have to call that a lesson learned. And one of the implications of that tangled logic is that I had to end up using a couple of STD optional parameters to pass extra information when needed, right? There's this target unit ID optional and this tactic optional. Just as a reminder, these buttons over here are tactics buttons. They're grayed out right now in this. This is just a screenshot. They're grayed out right now because they were, I guess it was the movement phase and not the combat phase. But during the combat phase, you would click on one of these, and that would be the tactic that you intend the unit to use when you initiate a combat. So unless the unit is in testudo formation, which obligates it to use the testudo tactic, we also fetch the current tactic from the scene, meaning which tactic button is currently held down. And this happens even during the movement phase, during the command phase, anytime you're doing a drag validation. But because I'm trying to keep this generic, I end up passing this kind of information at various points, even if it's not relevant. And the tactic is not really relevant to a move, and neither is a target ID, unless it's a relief of line. Anyway, the validate battle action, it's a pure virtual function in the entity class, as you can see there. The implementation in the unit class, there's overloaded functions, but the unit class's implementation refers the validation request to specific handlers, which are also virtual functions, depending on the context. In other words, depending on the particular segment of the turn that you're in. And this kind of contextual differentiation is something I'd wanted to avoid doing in the UI layer to reduce coupling, which is why I was just planning to use this validate battle action function, because again, we're now back in the simulation layer or the rules engine layer. So I didn't really want the UI to be saying, oh, it's the battle movement segment, so we do this, or oh, it's the combat segment, so we do that. But unfortunately, I had to resort to some of that. But my plan at the beginning was to use validate battle act, to use this as just a generic multi-purpose function called by the UI layer, and then have all of this contextualization occur here. But let's assume that it's a battle movement segment and it was a combat unit item that was clicked and dragged. So you can see in this situation, we do check this optional tactic parameter to see if it has value. Sorry, up here to see if it has value. And if so, we treat it as a proposed relief of line action and refer to the validate relief of line function. And if it doesn't have value, then we refer it to the validate battle move action. So we'll assume that it is a movement segment, technically called battle movement segment. In combat unit item handle drag validation, if the relief of line button is pressed in the battle board, then the target unit ID optional parameter is populated either with the ID of the unit in the mouse's grid square, if one is present. If one is not present, then we use this. This is just an enumerated value. All of the unit IDs in the game I just created contained in an enumeration, and this basically functions, well, for present purposes, it functions as the indicator of an invalid unit ID value. So it's an optional, so that basically has three states. It can be a valid unit ID, it can be an invalid unit ID, or it can be null optional, which means that there's no parameter. So going back to unit again, when validate battle actions called, we check to see whether, if it's the battle movement segment, we check to see whether this parameter has any value, and if so, we treat it as a proposed relief of line action and validate it using that function. And if it doesn't have any value, then we treat it as an ordinary battle move and validate it with this function. Validate battle move is a virtual function. I know this is a massive interface. It's a virtual function, but not pure virtual, and it returns an action valid object. Action valid is just a type def, a type alias for an STD pair, with also type aliases for booleans. Validate battle move is actually overridden by the combat unit and leader classes. But we're assuming in this example that the user clicked on a combat unit. So we'll look at combat units implementation. Here we're getting into the teeth of the rules enforcement code. As a preliminary matter, why do I call this action valid, and why does it have these, an eligible and a valid element? For that matter, why am I returning two distinct booleans here? Well, the eligible element, that is to indicate that the action is not that the unit is not eligible at all. So for example, let's say you click and drag a unit during the command segment. Well, that's not even, the unit can't move during a command segment, right? So that's not even eligible. It can't attack during a command segment, so it's not even eligible to do that. Or let's say it's the Roman movement segment and you click on a Parthian unit and drag it. Well, Parthian units are not eligible to move during a Roman movement segment. So there are some actions that I would classify as ineligible, and so that's what this Boolean is for. The valid Boolean is for where the unit is eligible to undertake an action of the type proposed by the user, but for whatever reason the particular choice is not valid. So during the movement phase, clicking on a friendly combat unit and dragging it to, dragging the mouse to a square with an enemy combat unit, well, you can't move into an enemy occupied square, right? So the unit is eligible to move, but the particular move location is invalid. So the reason we return, these two different things is that if you remember from the gameplay, in some cases I clicked on a unit and dragged and nothing happened. That's because the eligible parameter was false. In other cases, I clicked on a unit and dragged, and you could see the arrow, but it was mostly transparent. That was because the eligible element was true, so it's eligible, but valid was false. So it was an eligible action, but an invalid particular choice, right? But if both of these are true, then you would, when you clicked and dragged the unit, you'd see the arrow and it would be mostly opaque, right? So that's why I'm differentiating here. It's just to give the user a degree of feedback, okay, action is totally ineligible. It's an eligible unit, but it's not a valid action, or it's both eligible and valid. So the first thing that this function does is it calls the base class version, which contains some validation checks that are common to both leaders and combat units. The first thing it does is it checks what's the current state. If it's not a battle movement segment, then eligible is set to false. It's either a battle movement segment or, again, it's a combat segment and the unit conducted, it was a skirmish capable unit that conducted a skirmishable attack. It's now capable of moving even though it's a combat segment. So that's one test. Is the faction the active faction, right? If it's the Roman movement segment and the unit that's validating the proposed action, if it's a Parthian unit, then it's obviously not eligible, right? Does the unit have any movement points left? If not, it's not eligible to move, right? Only units of a panicked army can move off the battle grid, right? So it's either a square, one of the regular field of battle squares that you're trying to move into, or it's a camp square, or neither of these is true, but the the own faction is panicked and you're trying to move into your faction's flight area. So that's the row of the invisible grid squares just off the top and bottom edges of the map, right? So that's another check. In mountain pass battles, right, the three central files are eligible to move into. So any except for those three central files, the terrain would be coded as mountain. So if it's mountain terrain, now we're getting into the validity check, right? So you might be eligible to move because you passed these tests, but you're trying to move into a mountain hex, which you're not permitted to do. The grid square you're trying to move into must be adjacent to the one that you're currently in, right? Only certain units are capable of moving diagonally, right? So having made those checks, the unit returns this action valid object. It uses the brace initialization and returns it back to combat unit, which then performs its own checks, right? Well, I'm already seeing a logical mistake because we've already, I believe, already just checked this in the base class version, but whatever, we could fix that. The unit has to be in command in order to move, or it's autonomous. This parameter would be true if it's a berserk unit that's moving, right? Because then it doesn't have to be in command. It would be berserk, not in command. Also, you can't be disrupted. Your morale has to be normal and not disrupted or routed. Or units that are routed must automatically flee towards the friendly map edge. So if the autonomous, we could fix that. If the autonomous parameter is true and your morale equals routed, then this would come back. This would still be valid. And you're thinking, well, wait a minute, if it's routed or not, it disrupted, you can't click on it and route it. Yeah, well, but this validation function is also used by the pathfinding algorithm. It also validates moves, and so when the berserk units are moving, the A-star algorithm will check to make sure that movement into a particular square is valid. So that's what that's for. You can't move into a square that already has a combat unit in it, except when you're moving autonomously because you're fleeing. That's something I didn't touch on in the gameplay part of the video. Units that are fleeing will actually try and enter friendly occupied squares or squares occupied by friendly combat units because they're desperate to get off the map. They're fleeing, and they could potentially end up routing the unit whose square they're fleeing into, and now that unit has to route and try and flee off map. So you could have this chain reaction effect. So again, that's all done by the autonomous movement routines. And alternatively, there's no limit to the number of friendly units that can pile into a friendly camp square. So, and then it just returns this back. I believe that this ends up being returned ultimately back to the combat unit item that first made the validate battle action call. One thing you might be wondering is why this odd structure here. The way I've structured conceptually is, we start out with the assumption that a proposed action is eligible and valid, but it only takes failing any one of these checks for it to be changed to false. So you might think, well, if this first check is failed, why not just return false false, or E is false, V is true, but both of these have to be true in the UI layer for the UI layer to actually then permit the action to go forward. But the reason why I don't just return after the first test is failed, or the first time a test is failed, there's two reasons actually. One, for debugging purposes, it was useful to go through all of these checks, because if the first test failed and there were bugs in these other ones, it would be harder to see that when you're going through in when you're stepping through the program in debug mode, because you'll never get to the point where these other tests, where the bugs reveal themselves. So that was one reason why I spelled it out. But also, and more importantly, early on, I realized I was going to want to refactor this whole approach, so that action valid, instead of consisting of two booleans where a false value indicates that the action's not valid, instead I was going to refactor it so that it was returning two unsigned integers, and I was going to use bit flags to apply bit flags to those integers to indicate the specific reasons why something was ineligible or invalid. So in this refactoring, if both integer values are 0, that means all of the checks were passed and the action is valid. If one or the other of them had a value other than 0, that means that one of the flags was set in this bit flag, and that that would indicate that the action's not eligible or it's invalid. But at least the UI would then be able to extract the particular reasons from those unsigned integers and present the specific reasons to the user why his proposed actions were ineligible or invalid. And because they're bit flags, you can apply multiple bit flags to each unsigned integer, and that way you can display to the user all of the reasons why his proposed actions were invalid or ineligible. And in fact, here you can see I had started to put together these bit flag values that would indicate the reasons why why a particular action would either be ineligible or invalid, and you could then you'd apply these bit flags to those unsigned integers in the action valid object, and that that would just allow the UI to give the player more detailed feedback as to why something was not being allowed. So that's why I use this unusual structure. Anyway, now to unwind this call stack, the function was called here. In units validate battle action, and then that was originally called by combat unit item down here. So just uses a structured binding to capture the eligible and valid booleans. And again, if the action is eligible, you'll at least display the tac graphic. Tac graphic are those arrows that you see. And if the action is not eligible, you just hide the tac graphic completely, right? So like I said, if you click on a unit and it's not even eligible to do the action that you're indicating, you won't even see the arrow. It also, you'll see, it uses the valid the valid component of the action valid object, using the ternary operator. So if the action's valid, these are opacity values. So if the action's valid, you pass a value of 0.75. If the action's not valid, you pass a value of 0.25. And so in the display tac graphic function, you can see those 0.75 or 0.25 are used to initialize this opacity variable, and that determines whether the arrow is mostly transparent or mostly opaque. And just to tie this all up, remember that this hypothetical example of a unit click and drag to move it, the call was triggered by the mouse move event in entity hand in the entity item. But then, assuming the unit has, let's say you click on a unit, you drag it to the desired square, and then you release the mouse. Okay, that generates a mouse release event. Again, we check to see if there's a mouse drag in progress, and we check to see whether or not the unit is on the battle board. I think this was a late stage convenient function that I used to just abstract away the questions of whether the unit has fled the battle or whether it's been eliminated. So as long as if there's a mouse drag in progress and the unit is actually still in play on the field of battle, then you do this handle left mouse button release function, which is an abstract virtual function, but it's overridden in the combat unit item class. So you kind of go through that whole validation process again, because the validations that happen when you're dragging the mouse around, those are all preliminary. Like, that gives you feedback as you're positioning the mouse. But once you've positioned the mouse and then release the left mouse button, that indicates that you intend to do that action. So it basically goes through the same thing. It calls validate battle action again, which just is a last minute check to make sure that everything is still okay. And if it comes back eligible and valid, well, we're using a battle move in this example, assuming it's a move and not a relief of line. Well, the UI, the combat unit item, instantiates a conduct battle move command object and posts it to the command history object. The command history object calls the execute method on conduct battle move command, which in turn, it's got a pointer to the unit that you're moving. So it just conducts the conduct battle move method on the combat unit in question, and you're off, and then all sorts of things happen. So that in a nutshell is how the validation system works. And incidentally, the validate battle move logic was not nearly as complex as something like validating battle attacks. This is the comparable function for validating proposed attacks, and you can see it's even more tangled logic here. So I think we'll start to wrap this video up. It's already long enough. I just wanted to point out all of this validation logic because I thought it was the most notable thing about the application. Needless to say, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is the best way of doing something. And if anyone has any suggestions or critiques, feel free to leave comments. I'm more than happy to listen to constructive criticism. With all that said, I don't think this kind of approach, this kind of very streamlined, clicking and dragging interface is going to work with more complex games. If you've seen some of the other videos on my channel, I was toying with the idea of doing a digital implementation of GMT's Downtown game, which is the air war over North Vietnam. That's a much more complicated game, and I don't think a very streamlined interface is going to work because there's just too many things that you have too many options for a unit, right? It's not simply a question of clicking it and dragging it to an adjacent hex. You can climb, you can dive, you can turn, you can fire, right? The turn structure is not quite as rigid as the one in Trajan. So, this kind of approach will work for some games, but I think as I get into more complex implementations, I'm going to have to use a very different approach to validating user actions. Anyway, I hope I didn't bore anyone to death. Thank you for sticking with me, and I'll see you next time.